The world's most influential minds rarely rest where history expects them to. Their graves are scattered across continents, hidden in church corners, lost to war, or reduced to symbols rather than stone. Each burial site is the final outcome of human decisions, shaped by power, fear, belief, and circumstance rather than genius alone. To follow these graves is to trace how societies reward, reject, or reinterpret ideas over time. Long after the voices fell silent, the systems that governed their lives continued speaking through where, and whether, they were laid to rest. The quiet of a centuries-old cemetery carries a weight that few other places can match. Stones worn smooth by rain and time bear names that once commanded libraries, studios, and lecture halls. Here lie the minds that reshaped the world, yet their final resting places are often modest, overlooked, or strangely symbolic of their lives. There is a peculiar intimacy in tracing the graves of those who once redefined human thought, an understanding not only of what they created, but of the circumstances, decisions, and social structures that allowed, or forced, them to create. Why, for example, does the grave of Leonardo da Vinci in Amboise exude quiet reverence while that of Torquato Tasso in Rome hints at restless tension? The stones themselves, the locations, even the choice of epitaph, tell stories that textbooks rarely capture. Human history is punctuated by innovators whose works became the bedrock of culture, yet their burial sites reveal the delicate interplay of patronage, mortality, and reputation. The Renaissance, a period often romanticized for its rebirth of classical knowledge, was also a battleground of influence, where artists, writers, and thinkers navigated the tension between ambition and dependency. Understanding the graves of these figures requires more than biographical curiosity. It requires a systems-level approach to the human, societal, and institutional behaviors that governed life and death. By examining where these legends lie, we gain insight into patterns of recognition, networks of support, and societal valuation of intellect and creativity that continue to ripple through history. The 15th century in Italy was defined by a remarkable convergence of social, political, and technological forces. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan became crucibles for experimentation, where wealth and competition spurred cultural patronage. Florence's Medici family, for instance, understood that sponsoring artists was not merely philanthropy, it was an investment in political influence and social prestige. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and Sandro Botticelli all operated within this ecosystem, negotiating complex relationships with patrons who could make or break their careers. The graves of these figures, while now sites of reverence, were initially the product of negotiation between personal wishes and social expectations. Leonardo's interment in Amboise, under the aegis of King Francis I of France, reflects both the artist's late career mobility and the political mechanisms that preserved his legacy. The king's decision to host him, and eventually to oversee his burial, was a calculated act that ensured Leonardo's memory would be enshrined within a royal context, elevating his posthumous reputation beyond the Italian city-states he had left behind. Michelangelo, in contrast, returned to Florence after decades in Rome and ultimately chose burial in the Basilica of Santa Croce, surrounded by fellow luminaries. His grave is not merely a mark of his physical presence, but a declaration of Florentine pride, an institutionalized acknowledgement of genius interwoven with civic identity. This period illustrates a key principle. Graves are as much a function of social systems as of personal legacy. Decisions about location, monumentation, and inscription were mediated by patrons, guilds, and civic authorities. The cause, the explosion of creative output in a competitive, patronage-driven environment, led to a process in which artists navigated political alliances, social obligations, and personal ambition. The consequence was the institutionalization of memory, the placement of a grave, the grandeur of its monument, and its inscription became an early form of legacy management, shaping public perception long after death. Artists were not alone in navigating this complex interplay. Writers, philosophers, and scientists faced similar challenges, though the systems shaping their posthumous recognition were subtly different. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century had democratized access to knowledge, but it also introduced new anxieties about control over intellectual property and reputation. Figures like Desiderius Erasmus and Niccolo Machiavelli lived at the intersection of knowledge production and political risk. Their burial sites, modest by modern standards, reflect both societal ambivalence and personal circumstance. Erasmus, buried in Basel, lies in a relatively understated grave within the Cathedral of St. Peter. Though his works influenced European thought profoundly, the simplicity of his final resting place speaks to a deliberate humility and a recognition of ecclesiastical norms. In contrast, Machiavelli's initial interment in the Church of Santa Croce, later moved, mirrors the fluctuating political fortunes of his life and the posthumous controversy surrounding his writings. Here, human behavior, pragmatism, fear of censure, and the desire for recognition interacted with institutional systems to determine the physical markers of legacy. This interplay illuminates a broader pattern. Intellectuals often relied on societal validation to solidify memory, but their graves also served as instruments of subtle messaging. An understated tomb could communicate moral virtue. A grand monument could signal alignment with political power or civic pride. The cause, pursuit of ideas in politically charged environments, produced processes of negotiation with authorities and patrons. The consequence, centuries later, is a visible record of societal valuation. What was celebrated, tolerated, or suppressed? By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe's approach to artist and intellectual burials had begun to formalize. Cemeteries became more structured, inscriptions more symbolic, and memorials increasingly reflected the social hierarchies of the day. Baroque and Rococo styles emphasized grandeur and drama, mirroring the works these figures produced. The tombs of composers like Johann Sebastian Bach in Leipzig or painters like Diego Velázquez in Madrid illustrate an important human pattern, a desire for permanence through monumentality. These graves also reveal the dynamics of institutional recognition. Bach's burial in St. John's Church was initially modest, reflecting the status of a municipal musician. Only posthumous efforts by disciples and later admirers elevated the site into a locus of cultural memory. Velázquez's interment in the Pantheon of the court of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid mirrored his proximity to power, underscoring the interdependence of artistic achievement and social patronage. Cause and consequence are intertwined. Artists, life choices, and social networks shaped their burial, which in turn influenced how history remembers them. Across these centuries, a few patterns emerge. 1. Strategic positioning. Many innovators were interred in places that maximized visibility and symbolic association, often near patrons, fellow luminaries, or within institutions that codified their contributions. 2. Legacy management. The inscriptions, iconography, and even orientation of graves were deliberate acts communicating virtue, intellect, or moral philosophy. 3. Societal valuation. The prominence of a grave often reflected contemporary recognition more than artistic merit. Some genius was buried modestly due to political or financial constraints, only to be celebrated later through reinterment or monumentation. 4. Mortality as motivator. Awareness of impermanence influenced both the creation of work and the negotiation of legacy. The physical tomb became a systematized response to the inevitability of death, allowing society to preserve memory even as the individual faded. These dynamics illustrate that graves are more than endpoints. They are artifacts that encapsulate human decision-making, social hierarchies, and systemic processes. They are mirrors reflecting not only who these figures were, but how societies functioned and how culture assigned value. The impact of these early graves extends far beyond their physical sites. Leonardo's resting place in Ambas became a destination for scholars and admirers, transforming a local cemetery into a transnational shrine of genius. Michelangelo's tomb in Santa Croce reinforced Florence as a cultural capital and institutionalized the city's claim to artistic excellence. In intellectual terms, Erasmus's grave became a silent testament to moderation and scholarly dedication, influencing later generations' perceptions of humanist ideals. The consequences are enduring. Historical memory is curated through these physical markers. They shape cultural tourism, scholarly focus, and even urban identity. Each grave tells a story not only about death, but about how societies codify recognition, value creative work, and negotiate the tension between individual ambition and collective memory. By the 19th century, death no longer arrived quietly. It came after revolutions, factories, manifestos, collapsed empires, and personal breakdowns played out in public view. Cemeteries expanded beyond churchyards into vast, planned landscapes, mirroring societies that were growing more complex, bureaucratic, and ideologically divided. The graves of writers, artists, and intellectuals from this era do not simply mark individual lives. They map the psychological cost of modernity. If Renaissance tombs expressed civic pride and patronage, 19th century graves reveal conflict between individual and society, art and commerce, belief and doubt. This period marks a shift in how creative figures understood legacy. No longer primarily dependent on aristocratic patrons, writers and artists increasingly faced markets, censorship regimes, political persecution, and mass audiences. These systems altered not only how they lived, but how they died and how they were remembered. The grave became less a symbol of institutional honor and more a contested site of meaning, shaped by exile, scandal, nationalism, and posthumous reinterpretation. Romanticism emerged as a reaction to Enlightenment rationalism and industrial standardization. Its central belief, that emotional intensity and individual experience were the highest forms of truth, reshaped how artists viewed themselves. Many romantics embraced suffering as evidence of authenticity, and their deaths often reinforced the mythology they cultivated in life. Lord Byron's grave tells a story of reputation colliding with morality. When he died in 1824 while supporting Greek independence, Britain celebrated his political courage but recoiled from his personal life, marked by scandal, debt, and taboo relationships. The Church of England refused him burial in Westminster Abbey, despite his literary stature. Cause: Byron's open defiance of moral norms and institutions. Process: institutional rejection combined with national embarrassment. Consequence: burial in the family vault at Hucknall, far from England's literary pantheon. Only decades later did Westminster Abbey install a memorial, acknowledging what institutions initially denied. Byron's grave illustrates a recurring system of the era. Moral judgment outweighed cultural contribution, and recognition was often delayed until controversy cooled. His physical exclusion from the abbey paradoxically strengthened his legend as a rebel genius punished by conformity. As nation-states consolidated power in the 19th century, writers became symbols of national identity. Language, folklore, and shared history turned authors into cultural architects, and their graves into political landmarks. Victor Hugo's trajectory from political exile to national icon is mirrored precisely in his burial. Once banished for opposing Napoleon III, Hugo returned to France after the regime's collapse and died in 1885 as the country's most revered writer. Cause: Hugo's alignment with Republican ideals and popular literature. Process: state-orchestrated funeral and symbolic relocation. Consequence: burial in the Pantheon alongside France's greatest figures. Over 2 million people followed his funeral procession. His grave was no longer personal, it was national infrastructure, reinforcing shared values of resistance, humanism, and linguistic pride. Systems of power that once expelled him later absorbed him, using his legacy to stabilize national identity. Similar patterns emerged across Europe. Adam Mickiewicz in Poland, Alexander Pushkin in Russia, Alessandro Manzoni in Italy. Their graves became pilgrimage sites, reinforcing language and culture as tools of political cohesion. While some writers were elevated, others were crushed by the economic realities of industrial society. The rise of mass publishing created opportunity, but also precarity. Many artists died poor, unrecognized, or psychologically exhausted. Poe's grave in Baltimore is notable not for grandeur, but for uncertainty. His death remains unexplained, his original burial unmarked, and his reputation damaged by rivals who shaped early biographies. Cause: financial instability, addiction, and lack of institutional protection. Process: neglect, misinformation, and reputational sabotage. Consequence: a fragmented legacy reconstructed decades later. Only in the late 19th century did admirers raise a proper monument. Poe's grave demonstrates how fragile legacy becomes without systems of support. Markets rewarded productivity, not vulnerability, and those who fell through the cracks often required later generations to rehabilitate them. Visual artists faced similar pressures, particularly those who rejected academic norms. Their graves often reflect delayed recognition, buried in obscurity, later transformed into shrines. Van Gogh sold almost no paintings in his lifetime. He died in 1890 after years of mental illness, financial dependency, and social isolation. Cause: rejection by the art market and academic institutions. Process: dependency on family support, psychological deterioration. Consequence: modest burial in Auvers-sur-Oise. Only after his brother Theo's widow systematically promoted his work did Van Gogh's grave become a global pilgrimage site. Today, it symbolizes a core modern myth, that true innovation is invisible to its own time. His burial site exposes a system that rewards conformity first and originality later. The 19th century transformed cemeteries themselves. Père Lachaise in Paris, Highgate in London, and Montmartre became curated spaces, part museum, part archive. Burial location increasingly reflected ideological alignment rather than religious status. Marx died in 1883 stateless and largely ignored. His grave in Highgate Cemetery was initially modest. Cause: political radicalism and marginalization. Process: exclusion from mainstream institutions. Consequence: posthumous elevation through ideological movements. Only in the 20th century did his grave become monumental, reshaped by followers rather than the state. Unlike Hugo, Marx's legacy was not absorbed by existing systems, it generated alternative ones. His grave marks a different pathway to permanence, influence through ideas rather than institutional endorsement. As the 20th century approached, confidence in progress collapsed. War, urban alienation, and philosophical doubt reshaped art and thought. Many intellectuals died in exile, far from home, reflecting a world where belonging itself was unstable. Wilde died in Paris in 1900, disgraced and impoverished after imprisonment for gross indecency. Cause: conflict between personal identity and legal morality. Process: public shaming, incarceration, exile. Consequence: burial in Père Lachaise, initially neglected. Only decades later did admirers restore his grave, transforming it into a site of resistance and queer memory. Wilde's tomb charts a shift in human behavior. Societies that punish deviation often later reinterpret it as courage. Across this period, consistent mechanisms shaped posthumous fate. 1. Market forces replaced patronage, increasing visibility but also volatility. 2. Nation-states instrumentalized culture for identity and legitimacy. 3. Moral conformity influenced recognition, delaying acknowledgement. 4. Exile became common, disconnecting creators from homeland memory. 5. Legacy increasingly depended on advocates, not institutions. The grave became less a conclusion than a pause, waiting for cultural values to catch up. The cemeteries of the 19th and early 20th centuries function as maps of modern anxiety. They record the transition from collective belief to individual doubt, from stable hierarchies to contested narratives. These graves influence literary canons and syllabi, national myth-making, cultural tourism, political symbolism. More importantly, they remind us that recognition is rarely simultaneous with innovation. The distance between a life lived and a legacy secured is often measured in decades or centuries. By the time the 20th century erupts into world war, genocide, and mass media, burial itself will change again. Memory will fragment further. Graves will multiply across continents. And for many thinkers, there will be no grave at all, only absence. By the middle of the 20th century, the grave was no longer guaranteed. 2 world wars, genocides, forced migrations, and technological acceleration broke the continuity that had once linked life, death, and remembrance. For writers, artists, and intellectuals, legacy became increasingly unstable, shaped less by burial sites and more by archives, institutions, political struggles, and digital afterlives. Where earlier centuries used tombs to anchor memory, the modern era often scattered it. The question was no longer where these figures were buried, but whether burial could still contain their meaning at all. Ashes replaced bodies. Exile replaced homeland. In some cases, silence replaced stone. Yet even in absence, systems of memory persisted, through universities, movements, museums, and now, networks. The graves of modern intellectuals tell a story not of permanence, but of negotiation with a world that no longer promised it. The 20th century produced unprecedented intellectual output alongside unprecedented destruction. Many writers and thinkers died displaced, stateless, exiled, or erased by violence. Their graves, when they exist, often sit far from the cultural landscapes they shaped. Walter Benjamin's death in 1940 epitomizes the collapse of continuity. Fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe, he committed suicide at the Spanish border, believing he would be captured and returned to France. Cause: totalitarian persecution and closed borders. Process: forced flight, bureaucratic obstruction, psychological exhaustion. Consequence: no known grave, a symbolic memorial in Portbou. Benjamin's absence is itself historical evidence. His legacy survived not through burial but through posthumous publication, academic revival, and theoretical influence. The system failed to preserve his body, but intellectual institutions preserved his work, demonstrating a modern shift from physical to textual immortality. For many intellectuals of Jewish, Roma, and other persecuted communities, death occurred within systems designed to erase individuality. Graves were replaced by mass pits or ash. Anne Frank's diary became one of the most influential texts of the 20th century, yet she has no grave. She died in Bergen-Belsen, her remains indistinguishable among thousands. Cause: industrialized genocide. Process: dehumanization, systemic erasure. Consequence: symbolic memorialization through text and education. Her legacy exists entirely outside traditional burial systems. Museums, curricula, and translations replaced tombstones. This marks a critical shift. Remembrance moved from geography to narrative. Totalitarian states often attempted to control memory by controlling burial. Some figures were honored publicly, while others were erased or buried anonymously. Orwell requested a simple Anglican burial, rejecting monumentality despite global influence. Cause: distrust of ideological spectacle. Process: personal instruction limiting memorialization. Consequence: a modest grave emphasizing human scale over myth. Orwell's burial reflects a conscious resistance to legacy inflation. Unlike earlier eras where institutions decided remembrance, modern figures sometimes attempted to limit it, aware of how easily memory could be weaponized. Post-war globalization transformed writers and artists into transnational figures. Their graves became international sites, detached from national ownership. Born in Algeria, celebrated in France, politically alienated from both, Camus died suddenly in 1960. Cause: colonial identity conflict. Process: cultural displacement. Consequence: burial in Lermarin, a village rather than a capital. Camus's grave resists nationalist appropriation. Its quiet location mirrors his philosophy: human dignity without grand systems. This reflects a broader trend. Modern intellectuals increasingly rejected symbolic centralization. Cremation and scattering of ashes became common, reflecting modern skepticism toward permanence. Jean-Paul Sartre, cremated, ashes placed in Montparnasse Cemetery. Samuel Beckett, minimalist grave matching his aesthetic. Virginia Woolf, ashes buried beneath a tree at Monk's house. These choices reveal an alignment between philosophy and death. The grave becomes an extension of worldview rather than societal expectation. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, memory shifted again. Archives went online, manuscripts were digitized, graves became optional. Cause: technological preservation. Process: migration of memory to networks. Consequence: legacy decoupled from physical location. Today, a reader may encounter a writer's work without ever knowing or caring where they are buried. Influence travels faster than geography. 1. Displacement replaces rootedness. 2. Institutions preserve ideas, not bodies. 3. Memory becomes contested and decentralized. 4. Individuals resist monumentalization. 5. Absence itself becomes meaningful. The system no longer guarantees recognition through stone. Legacy is fluid, revised continuously. The graves, or absences, of modern intellectuals reveal a civilization uncertain about permanence. Where earlier societies built monuments, the modern world builds archives, museums, and algorithms. This has profound consequences. Cultural memory is faster but less stable. Recognition is broader but more fragile. History becomes editable. Yet the impulse remains the same: to resist disappearance. Across 3 eras, the graves of writers, artists, and intellectuals chart humanity's evolving relationship with meaning. Renaissance graves assert civic order and patronage. Romantic and modern graves reveal conflict and delayed recognition. Contemporary graves and absences reflect fragmentation and uncertainty. The long-term impact is clear. Culture does not preserve genius automatically. It requires systems: economic, political, institutional, and human decisions shaped by fear, pride, belief, and hope. In the end, these graves are not about death. They are about what societies choose to remember, how they justify those choices, and what they fear losing. Stone erodes, names fade, but ideas, once released, travel far beyond the ground that first received their creators. That is the true legacy these graves reveal.